It's the worst of the CBC for November 18th, 2019, the show where I watch the CBC so you don't have to. All right, so let's get to the biggest omission and worst covered story. The worst covered story, I'm going to just go in on women's hockey. They literally spent 5 minutes on this. And the reason why it's the worst covered story is, one, because this story didn't need to be on the news about basically why are not enough people watching women's hockey. We all know why. But because they had to spend 5 minutes on that and other nonsense, they're not covering the actual biggest story in the entire world right now, which is the ongoing protests in Iran. And this is sort of the third protest against Iran in the Middle East they're not covering. It started in Iraq, where the Iraqi people were protesting the Iranian government, basically running their country. Then there were protests in Lebanon against the Iranian government, basically running their country. The people were slaughtered because the Islamic Republic, the IRGC, actually uses lethal violence against protesters. They don't do massive killings, but they kill targeted leaders. They will send snipers into crowds and kill one or two or three over here, 1, 2, 3 over here. Not like the Syrians where they just kill dozens and dozens at a time that sparked an intense riot. They use death as an intimidation tactic quite effectively. So you have dozens of people have been killed in Iran. The regime has blacked out the internet there, so there's no Twitter, there's no social media for them. But all the Iranian leaders, so Javad Zarif, the propaganda minister, the Ayatollah Rouhani, they still have their Twitter accounts active, even though they shut down the Twitter accounts of their entire country. So this needs to be further explained, because the reason why the media is not covering it, and I've gone on this before, is because they'd have to admit that they were wrong about all of this. Right? They're talking about the Iran deal and how great the Iran deal was and how reckless Trump was to get out of the Iran deal and Iran deal. The Iran deal just gave the Iranians $150 billion to continue funding global terrorism. And other countries don't like when Iran funds terrorism in their country or uses their government as proxies to fund terrorist groups, because the Lebanese people and the Iraqi people don't benefit from this. But what you have here is the Iranian regime had to put a increased price on gas, the gas tax. They essentially instituted a carbon tax. Now, there were widespread discontent, and there was massive protests 2 years ago, and they've sort of been simmering down, but there's still this massive unrest against the regime in general. But there was an spark in the most recent rounds was because of the massive increase on a gas tax, because they're trying to, gas tax their civilians into funding their terrorism. And what's fascinating here is the Iranian people are, other than ripping down anti-American banners, burning statues of the Ayatollah, which is huge, they're actually basically lighting their gas reserves on fire. They're saying, we have to pay so much gas. What they're doing is they're self-sanctioning. So when we talk about how reckless Trump is and how evil he is, and when Ilhan Omar says, sanctions are bad, I don't believe in sanctions. Oh, my sexy, sexy brother. Ooh, damn sexy brother. But then she talks about how evil sanctions are. We shouldn't put them on Turkey and Iran, but we should sanction the Jews. The Iranian people are essentially putting sanctions on their own country to overthrow their own regime. So it's going to be amazing the next time you hear about how reckless Trump's sanctions on Iran are, when the Iranian people are actually self-sanctioning themselves, going out in the streets to try and bring down their own government, because they know their government will never have their own interests in mind and only use their money to finance global terrorism. Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all of these are Iranian proxies. They have groups out in West Africa. Parts of the slaughter of Christians in Nigeria is funded by Iran. Our Muslim Brotherhood funded. So that's a fascinating thing we need to cover. We really need to cover it. I'm glad they're covering the Hong Kong protests, but these are equally as important. Can you imagine if we shine light on this? The reason we don't shine light on this is because Trudeau ran on being more friendly with Iranians and saying, they're our friends or whatever, and then they killed a bunch of Canadians. Obama did his whole foreign policy on bowing down to the Iranians and empowering Iran. And Trump has made his foreign policy sort of centered against Iran. So this would be the tantamount to saying Obama was wrong, Trump was right, so you'll never see this covered. Now, let's go to the worst covered story of the day. Instead of talking about all of this, we have to talk about why people aren't watching women's hockey. Why is there no professional hockey league for women? 5 minutes was spent on this, where they couldn't figure it out. Okay. And, I'm going to say, I am fully in favor of girls playing hockey, okay? If I had a daughter, or when I have a daughter, I will happily encourage her to play hockey. I think it's a good thing. Women should play sports. Canadian women should play hockey. Encourage your daughters to play hockey. There is a big step between, I want to see my 9-year-old daughter play hockey, and if the Prime Minister doesn't show up to my 9-year-old girl's hockey game, this is the patriarchy, okay? And the former is the case that I'm making. The latter is the case that the CBC is making. Why isn't there a professional women's hockey league? It's only Olympics. Okay. The WNBA is a welfare league. We have to talk about this straight up. The WNBA is financed by the NBA. They lose around $10 million a year. Why aren't women athletes making more in the WNBA when they're playing better basketball, says the New York Times? Because it's a welfare league. The league loses money. The NHL doesn't have the money to finance a welfare league. It's already a league that has revenue sharing within its own league. So they have teams like the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Detroit Red Wings, the Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers, Boston Bruins. Those teams that make money finance our own welfare teams in the NHL, like the Phoenix Coyotes, which lose money, or the Arizona Coyotes now. All of Arizona supports the Coyotes. So there are teams already in the NHL that are dragging down the rest of the league and losing money. So the NHL doesn't have the money to finance another league as a charity case for women's hockey. It's just not going to happen. And the CBC is like, so I don't mind talking about women's hockey and need to go to sports, but what I do mind is the lies, the obfuscation, and trying to blame basic financial realities and biological realities on the evil of the populace, right? This is just gaslighting the population to the extreme. And I mean, if we want to talk about why there's no women's hockey, I mean, Rogers and Bell way overpaid for the hockey contracts, right? So they paid football money for hockey is essentially what you need to know about the business. And this is why Rogers are cutting so many prominent personalities. Bob McCown was gone. Kipros was gone. And this is kind of why they were so quick to fire Don Cherry, because he was making money. They really, really want to cut back on costs. However, if you want to increase women's hockey or get into women's hockey league, you kind of need people like Don Cherry, who've been big supporters of women's hockey. You can't institute a culture war, because sports is supposed to bring people together. So if you're trying to divide, this is what I hate, is we're turning women's sports into an element of the culture war and marketing women's sports to the left, and the left doesn't watch sports. So they're not going to watch women's sports. Now, if you want women's hockey, you probably should not be instituting culture wars into sports, because you need both sides of the country to support the sport so the money can trickle down and have enough to finance a women's hockey league. This is basic economics. This is basic reality. But we literally spent 5 minutes on the CBC avoiding any reasonable hockey points. And good on Haley Wickenheiser for making the Hockey Hall of Fame. One of the few women in there that deserves it. They should not be given a 1 per year quota. It's a bit demeaning. But that's my views on women's hockey and Iran and the CBC, which today gets a 7 out of 10 on the Rosemary Barden scale of bias. So that's it for today. I will see you tomorrow.